Today we're going to learn about one of the most famous paintings of all time. The painting is called the Mona Lisa, and you've probably seen it or a variation of it at some point. It was painted by a man named Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was born in a small town called Vinci, which is why he is Leonardo da Vinci, so that's of Vinci. And it's a small little village outside of Florence in Italy, all the way in Europe across the Atlantic Ocean. He was born in the year 1452. That was over 500 years ago that he was born. And he grew up in that little village. And when he was somewhere in his teenage years, between 14 and 16, he moved to Florence and he started to study with a master painter named Verrocchio. And he was part of the Painters Guild. And he worked there for several years with him. In 1478, at the age of 26, he became an independent artist under the protection of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Eventually, he left Florence to move to Milan, which is in northern Italy, and he lived there for about 20 years while he was painting. While he was there, he was attached to the court of Lodovico Sforza. And while he was there, he was able to use his talent to produce things like music. He was able to decorate. He was able to do pageants, portrait paintings. He worked on engineering projects, and he especially worked on engineering for things like bridges and building things for war. So he was really, really smart. He moved back to Florence around the year 1500, and that was his home, but he did continue to travel a lot. When he was 61 years old, at the end of his life, he started to work for the Medici family, and they're a very, very famous family in Italy. And he worked for their family, and the Medici family, they even, at that time, Pope Leo X was the man that he was working for. That was his brother. So they were a pretty big deal in Italy at that time. So Leonardo da Vinci was ahead of most people for his time, and they actually say that he is one of the most popular artists and one of the most progressive artists of the Renaissance time, and that's when he lived. It was called the Renaissance. So his artwork was obviously very, very beautiful, and he was very popular at the time, but this painting in particular kind of went somewhat unnoticed. The King of France bought it, and then it just kind of got passed along. Louis XIV had it, and then it got moved to the Louvre, which is where it is now, but it actually was moved a bit more after that. There was a man by the name of Napoleon, and at one point he had it moved to his bedroom, and that was in the late 1700s. But after that, it went back to the Louvre again, and it has stayed there since. It actually has a fascinating history. It was stolen in the year 1911. They brought in famous artists like Pablo Picasso to question them to see if they had stolen the painting, and they couldn't figure it out for years. Eventually, they were able to figure out that it was actually a museum employee who stole it. He hid in a broom closet, and when the museum was closed, he snuck out, he put it under his coat, and he just walked right out of the building with it, and he kept it in his apartment for 2 years. Now, the museum employee, he worked in France at the Louvre, but he was actually Italian, and he believed that the painting belonged to the Italian people because Leonardo da Vinci was an Italian artist, and the woman that he painted, her name was Lisa. She was also Italian, and her husband was Italian, and he thought that it belonged to the Italian people, so he wanted to steal it back and sell it to an Italian museum so it could be shown in Italy. So the painting was returned in 1913, 2 years after he had stolen it, and he only served a couple months of a sentence in jail for the theft of the painting, and people in Italy actually hailed him as a hero. They were quite impressed by what he did. Since then, small things have happened. People have spilled acid or thrown rocks at the painting, but very little damage was done, and they have people that work at the museum that oversee the preservation of the painting, and they have kept it looking really great. And now today, that painting is over 500 years old. And you can go see it today, but it is heavily guarded and it's behind glass and it's really protected. They've got it in a very controlled environment so that hopefully it will last for hundreds of years more. So now that we know a lot about Leonardo da Vinci, we're going to learn a little bit about the woman in the painting, okay? So Mona is actually an Italian word for, it's kind of like saying ma'am or madam or my lady in English, but it's in Italian. So it's kind of like Lady Lisa or ma'am Lisa, madam, etc. It's kind of a formal and polite way of saying her name, okay? So she was the wife of Mona Lisa was the wife of a man by the name of Francesco del Giocondo, and he was a wealthy silk merchant. And he had this painting commissioned in celebration of the birth of their son. And back then they didn't have photographs, and so if you wanted to have, you know, like your picture up, you would have to have a painting done instead. And so he had this painting done, and he started it in, I believe, the year 1502. And he worked on it for almost 20 years, primarily for about 4 years, but it took almost 20 years before it was done. Why it didn't go to the family that commissioned it to be painted, I don't know, but eventually it was sold to the King of France. So kind of interesting. We don't really know why. So we do know that her face is painted of Mona Lisa. That is her face. But Leonardo used a different model for her hands and her body. So it's kind of what we would call a composite. That's like bringing multiple pieces together. So it's kind of an interesting painting. So it's supposed to be of her likeness, but you would have to sit still for a very, very long time to have your portrait painted back then. And so maybe she thought that she shouldn't have to sit still that long. So she sat still long enough to get her face painted, but he used a different model for her body. So the painting went largely unnoticed for hundreds of years, but it gained popularity in around like the 1850s, like in the mid 1800s. And then it just became more and more and more popular. And now some people would argue it's probably the most popular or most famous rather painting of all time. You may have seen it in cartoons that you have watched. So I'm going to show you a few pictures of some examples of how people use the Mona Lisa. We call it pop culture, or that stands for popular culture. It's short for that. And so you might see it in popular cartoons that you like to watch, where they will kind of have this same format of like a woman posed with her arms that way, seated. And it's because it's such a famous painting that they will use that likeness to create other art kind of to mimic this original artwork. So people, one of the things that makes it most famous that people talk about is her smile. They think it's just, she kind of embodies femininity and a woman, and she has just the perfect kind of smile. She's smiling a little bit with her eyes and a little bit with her mouth, and she just looks pleasant all around. And so people often talk about Mona Lisa's smile as if that might be the most famous component of Mona Lisa in this painting. So I hope that you guys learned a lot about the Mona Lisa and a little bit about Leonardo da Vinci. And I hope you enjoyed some of the other paintings that we got to look at today. Thank you so much for spending time with me. Bye.